Latin America moves back to the left. We will take a look at the latest developments and what that could mean for the region. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The political pendulum is shifting in Latin America. A few years ago, most of the countries in the region replaced liberal left-leaning governments with conservative right-wing office holders. But discontent with the economy, inequality, and the way the COVID-19 pandemic was handled is bringing change again. CGTN's Paulo Cabral reports from Sao Paulo.
For many years, Clayton Lima was a staunch supporter of Brazil's leftist Workers' Party. Then, in the 2018 elections, he switched sides and threw his support behind Jair Bolsonaro. But he's not happy with the current president's right-wing government and plans to vote again for leftist candidates next year.
Since the Workers' Party had already been governing the country for 4 consecutive terms, not only me, the Brazilian people as a whole thought it would be time for change, to see what would happen. So we chose Bolsonaro, as we thought things could improve, but now we see that was a bad decision.
The right-wing wave that swept across Latin America in recent years appears to be shifting again. The first signs of a leftist resurgence came from Mexico in 2018 with a landslide presidential win of Andrés Manuel López Obrador and a government often described as the most left-wing ever to rule the country. 1 year later, Koernerism returned to Argentina with the victory of President Alberto Fernández, alongside the former president Cristina Fernández de Kirchner as his vice president, and ending after just 1 term the presidency of right-wing businessman Mauricio Macri. In Bolivia, after Evo Morales was forced to resign and a right-wing politician took over as interim, socialists returned to power in a commanding election win by Luis Arce last October. In Peru, schoolteacher and trade unionist Pedro Castillo is poised to end years of conservative governments with a razor-thin lead over hard-right opponent Keiko Fujimori in this month's presidential election is still being questioned in courts. In Chile, right-wing candidates won only 37 of the 155 seats of the assembly elected to write the country's new constitution earlier this year, with leftists and independent candidates winning the remainder. And trouble may be ahead for Brazil's Bolsonaro too. The right-wing leader is suffering record low ratings for his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, while polls ahead of next year's election show him being soundly defeated by former leftist president Lula da Silva. The right-wing wave in Latin America does seem to be losing strength in several countries in the region. One question is whether leftists are ready and organized enough to gain from the political opportunities that arise today. Guilherme Boulos, a rising star from the leftist Socialism and Liberty Party, PSOL, says he sees the right-wing cycle coming to an end.
O ciclo de extrema-direita não foi só na América Latina, foi no mundo todo.
This political cycle of the extreme right did not happen only in Latin America. It happened all over the world. It was led by Donald Trump in the United States, and in the United Kingdom it began with the Brexit. It expanded because of a disbelief in the political system.
Political winds seem now to be blowing in favor of Latin America's left wing, but whether the shift holds and for how long is impossible to predict. Paulo Cabral, CGTN, Sao Paulo.
There's a lot to talk about. Let's get to our panel. From New York, Alejandro Velasco is an associate professor of history at New York University. Here in Washington, D.C., Arthur Estopinan is the president of the Estopinan Group, a political consultancy company. Lucas Koerner is a political analyst and editor for VenezuelaAnalysis.com. He joins us from Philadelphia. And from Sao Paulo, journalist Gustavo Ribeiro is the founder of The Brazilian Report. Welcome to all of you. Arthur Estopinan, let me start with you. We saw many left-wing governments come to office in the first half of this decade. Then in the second half of the decade, we saw right-wing office holders, and now it's shifting again to the left. What, in your view, accounts for these shifts that we see from one end of the political spectrum to the other?
Well, the reality is, as your reporter so stated very well, that the democracies in Latin America seem to be shifting. And the pandemic COVID-19 is one reason, because unfortunately these governments have not dealt with the pandemic really well. And that is one of the main problems, that the poor classes don't feel represented by the government, and that is a very serious situation. American-type democracy in Latin America is not working, and it's not working because there's no foundation for civil societies. And this is coming from a hardcore Republican that is saying this, but that's the reality. And the reality is, until the middle class grows in Latin America, that unfortunately we're going to see this trend continue. As your report correctly stated, Colombia, the presidential candidates that are leading are in the left. Brazil and Chile for the next year's election. So the situation for democracies in Latin America is not looking very favorable at this time.
Arthur, can we put this down to COVID-19 by itself? I mean, are there any other factors that are at play here? What about the non-delivery of what many of these political leaders have promised? Basic things like rural education, water, sanitation, healthcare.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is absolutely correct. The reality is that the middle class has not participated, because the middle class is shrinking all the time. And then the population see, well, let's try a new government, but they unfortunately, more government doesn't mean better services. But the majority of these populations feel disenfranchised, and they feel that they don't have the COVID vaccine. For a long time, they didn't have masks. They felt abandoned by these governments, so they're like, well, let's try something different. What we need is political reform in Latin America. We need educational reform, like you said, so that the young people can either do vocational work or innovation, computers. We need the judicial reform to establish a rule of law, so that the privileged cannot get away without paying for crimes, and all kinds of different reforms. We need economic reform as well. So, yep.
Right. Alejandro Velasco, talking about political reform, you were interviewed by Bloomberg, and you were quoted in that piece in which you say what is happening in Latin America is an exhaustion of the political party model. Explain that to us. What does that mean?
Well, I think part of what we've seen, and this accounted to some extent for the left-wing wave that was mentioned in the report in the beginning of the century. What you had in Latin America for a long time was the attempt to build a party system that would break the entrenched rule of personalist leaders throughout the continent. And what you had was that what you experienced with those party systems couldn't actually deliver, especially on long-stemming structural and historical inequalities that tended to get worse, especially in the era of structural adjustment and neoliberal reform in the 1990s. And so what you had was a series of personalist leaders come to power, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Lula in Brazil, et cetera, but they didn't really have a tremendously strong party foundation. And so to some extent, when that coincided with the collapse of the commodity boom that really kept aloft many of these governments in terms of their ability to distribute resources, what you had was a shift away from the idea that these leaders and the people that they appointed as their successors could in fact deliver. What you found now, of course, is that their replacements on the right have not also been able to deliver. In fact, quite the opposite. Inequality has grown, insecurity has grown, et cetera, et cetera. And so now what we find is, we're going to get rid of all these party systems which have entrenched corruption, which have entrenched inequality, and try something new. And what that suggests to me is that it's less of an ideological shift, and really it's a kind of it's a looking for an alternative.
Right, good point. Lucas Koerner, what do you make of these shifts? Does it tell us that the voters in Latin America are not really married to ideologies or even personalities, that they are looking at policies and performance?
Because I like to take a longer historical view to look at the crisis of neoliberalism in the 1990s. As Alejandro correctly pointed out, this was the kind of the context in which these leftist movements, this leftist tide emerges, and in reaction to the crisis of the party system. But I think that what you have seen is not so much a rupture, but I think a continuity in terms of the organizing of social movements and left-wing parties to provide an alternative to neoliberalism, which they were actually quite successful in many respects in terms of reducing inequality, in terms of expanding employment, reducing poverty, et cetera, actually creating the middle class that your guest was pining for. That this is the largest ascension of poor people into the middle class in Latin America took place in countries like Brazil, Venezuela, Argentina, et cetera. So I think that it's important to recognize the continuity and that the staying power of the left. It's not so much, I don't think the cycle or the tide metaphor is so useful, because the left in many cases was ousted from power in U.S.-backed coup attempts in Brazil in 2016, in Bolivia in 2019, in Honduras in 2009, in Haiti in 2004, et cetera. There are more examples. So I think that we had the resurgence of the left is not so much a resurgence, but a continuity of organizing in the PT, the Workers' Party in Brazil, which continues to be a very strong party, the MAS in Bolivia, and other social movements that are continuous in Chile and elsewhere that are building the foundation for an alternative to the established neoliberal order.
Arthur Estopinan, what do you make of that? Luke is telling us there that, relatively speaking, the left has done better than the right, and in many instances, their efforts have been stymied by the fact that they've been ousted out of power.
Well, I don't believe that is the case. If not, the citizens of those countries, would have continued to vote for the left, but they opted to throw Morales out because they did not, like the way that the economic situation was moving. We saw a right-wing government in Ecuador that was just elected. So I don't quite believe that. I believe that the fundamental disenchantment with the current government of the right is that they have been the masses have been forgotten, and they have not been taken care of, and there's too much corruption, there's too much power in a very few families and concentrated on the top. The middle class needs to expand, and that is one of the secrets of the United States and why we have so much progress, because the majority of Americans do well, and they study, they have a good education, and they move from a poor class to a better class, and that doesn't happen in Latin America.
Gustavo Ribeiro, the Brazilian president, who's been a very controversial president for what he said and what he's done, he will run for re-election next year. He has been compared to the United States former President Donald Trump. Do you think he could fall victim to the same fate as Donald Trump and not win?
Well, I'm very careful in making comparisons between the Brazilian political system and the U.S. because these two political systems are extremely different. For instance, Donald Trump would not have been elected in 2016 if the U.S. had the same system as Brazil. And Jair Bolsonaro won in 2018 with 55 million votes. He is one of the top two most popular politicians in Brazil, alongside Lula. The outlook is not great for him right now. Lula leads all polls. Lula has this sort of nostalgia effect because he ruled Brazil during the commodities boom, and he may have a very compelling argument come next year's election to compare, well, look at how people lived during my presidency and what is happening now in Brazil. I think Bolsonaro's fate will ultimately hinge on Brazil's ability to bounce back economically. Some government officials have said that they believe if Brazil grows anywhere around 5.5 to 6% this year, and somewhere around 3.5 and 4% next year, the president is going to be reelected. I think there is a point. I think the polls right now do not necessarily translate how tough the election will be next year. I think it would be a mistake to rule Bolsonaro out and to see him as less than extremely competitive, which he has managed to prove himself to be very strong with a sizable part of the electorate. With all the controversy that has surrounded his presidency so far, the fact that he still commands 25% of the electorate, which is low for regular Brazilian standards, but considering the fact that Brazil is traversing the worst recession on record, it says something about his political strength.
Right, Gustavo, the economy could turn around, but to what extent will his fate be determined by his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic? I mean, if we look at the numbers, 500,000 in Brazil, people have died, and Brazil has just passed India, actually, in the number of daily deaths.
Well, I think it's hard to argue that his pandemic response has been anything but disastrous and irresponsible. That being said, I think his fate will ultimately hinge on the economy. For a sizable portion of the Brazilian electorate, death is already part of daily life in terms of urban violence, lack of access to sanitation. I think this will not necessarily play the biggest role, especially because a lot of state governors are advancing in their vaccination calendars, and that could bode well for Bolsonaro, even if he has no merit whatsoever in how vaccination advances in Brazil.
Alejandro Velasco, there is still no outcome in the election in Peru. Pedro Castillo has a razor-thin lead over the conservative right-wing candidate, Keiko Fujimori. This is what she had to say about the election. Let's listen.
Peru is a country that is strategically, geopolitically speaking, crucial in Latin America. And that is why the international left is trying this at any cost. And with all these manipulations we've seen on the table to try to twist the popular will.
Now, Alejandro, Keiko Fujimori also criticized the Argentinian president for congratulating Castillo even before we knew the official results of the election. But what do you make of her assertion that, and I'm quoting her here, that the international left is trying to manipulate the election?
Well, I mean, the reality is that the so-called international left has been deployed as a boogeyman for decades, really, in Latin America. I mean, you can extend it all the way back to, the Cold War and the specter of sort of the left rising from, from the mountains and overtaking governments was extremely strong, and of course led to tremendously reactionary responses, including in places like Peru during the time of Keiko Fujimori's father's presidency in the 1990s, and that's part of the debate at present. So to some extent, this is a tried trope of trying to point to an international conspiracy. Certainly was alive in the time of Chavez's presidency in Venezuela. But what ends up happening, as we saw in the United States, is that this is much more about creating doubt and uncertainty about electoral processes rather than about actually pointing to anything that is credible or evidence-based. And in fact, in Peru, the National Electoral Authority, the Electoral Junta there, has already dismissed several dozen of the allegations that Fujimori's party has made about irregularities in the vote. And so really it plays into a larger dynamic, especially in Peru, which is that even if Castillo wins, he will do so with a tremendously narrow margin, which will make him immediately an actually very weak president. And what we've seen in the case of Peru is that presidents have not lasted more than 2 to 3 years. And so I think what she's doing is laying the foundations for eventually, overtaking Castillo beyond the elections.
Lucas Koerner, let's talk about Venezuela. It's one of the holdouts from the pink tide. It has not shifted to the right, but it is struggling economically, despite the fact that it sits atop some huge oil reserves. Where do you see Venezuela going politically?
I think that Venezuela remains in kind of a standstill, a kind of a deadlock, where on the one hand, you have seen some important developments in terms of the efforts of the Maduro government to form alliances with the more moderate sections of the opposition that have opposed sanctions and opposed the possibility of military intervention in the country. Whereas, on the other hand, the Biden administration continues the Trump-era policy of putting its weight behind the self-proclaimed interim president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, who is no closer to sitting in Miraflores than he was on January 23rd, 2019. Yet he continues to claim to preside over an interim government and receives funding from the United States and continues to call for sanctions against his own country, which, according to economist Francisco Rodriguez, one of the foremost experts on Venezuela's economy and no friend of the Maduro government, says that some $13 billion annually is the toll of the U.S. blockade against Venezuela. So there is now calls from Congress for this to be lifted. So I think this is really the lifting of the economic sanctions against Venezuela, the sine qua non for any kind of real kind of political transformation in terms of the correlation of forces and, really breathing room for the economy, which has dramatically suffered since the imposition of U.S. sanctions in 2017, but also from a previous recession that began previously due to the collapse of oil prices beginning in 2014.
Arthur Estopinan, what do you make of the situation in Venezuela right now? What do you think it's going to take for the economy in that country to turn around?
Well, I believe that having free and fair elections is the ticket for the country to move forward. And the Biden administration, as the panelists just mentioned, has maintained the current sanctions and the current policies as the Trump administration. Not sure if philosophically they agree, or they're looking at the electoral voters in the state of Florida, the Cuban Americans, Venezuelans, and Nicaraguans, and that form an important, potent voting bloc, and they don't want socialism to continue in Venezuela.
Right, Arthur, I get your point there, but there are those who will say that Maduro was the legitimately elected president of Venezuela.
Well, I mean, if you could talk about all of the human rights violations, and you could talk about, the way that the election was held, and the claims of illegitimacy, so you could argue. You could argue that he is really not legitimate because of the lack of transparency.
All right.
No international electoral observers, etc.
Right. Let me give Lucas a chance to quickly respond to that, and then I want to move on. Lucas?
Nicolas Maduro was re-elected in 2018 with 6 million votes, which accounts to around 30% of the total electorate in the country, which is on par with Barack Obama, and more than Barack Obama. This is
okay, Lucas, we're having problems with your audio, Lucas. We'll try to fix that. I want to move on to Gustavo while we try to fix that. Gustavo, if we look at the political situation in Brazil right now, ahead of the election next year, it seems to be extremely polarized. On the one side, you have Jair Bolsonaro, who is on the right, and then you have Lula da Silva, who is on the left. I mean, is there any space for a candidate in the middle?
I don't think so. I think we are seeing a center-right camp that is highly divided. We have too many people trying to present their presidential bid. I think this camp will not unify soon enough and will not be strong enough to steal votes both from Bolsonaro and Lula. Since Joe Biden won in the U.S., the political establishment in Brazil has tried to come up with this Brazilian Biden, which would be a perfect mix of conservative with liberal touches, or the other way around. But I don't see this happening right now. I think Bolsonaro is too well established in the right, and Lula too well established in the left, and anyone in between them would fight for scrapes. At this point, nobody that is not called Lula or Bolsonaro is polling in the double digits.
Lucas, my apologies for cutting you off earlier, but I believe we have now restored that line to you. You were telling us about the situation in Venezuela and responding to Arthur telling us that there is a big question mark over the legitimacy of the election of Maduro. Go ahead.
Indeed, I covered Venezuela's 2018 election on the ground, and it was clear that there was no concrete allegation, concrete evidence of fraud with regard to that election. Maduro was reelected with 6.2 million votes, which is approximately equal to 30% of the Venezuelan electorate, which is comparable to what most U.S. presidents win in any given electoral contest, including Joe Biden, which I think he got around 32%, 33%. So I think that the problem was that the opposition opted to boycott rather than supporting the opposition candidate who could have defeated Maduro, because the opposition candidate, Henry Falcón, was not as radical in terms of wanting to completely overturn the existing order established by 20 years of Chavista governance, and including overturning the constitution like the opposition did during the 2002 coup in Venezuela. So this was the problem, and as such, they have pursued a radical coup of sanctions and military threats, and this is not a solution for Venezuela, and that this is the main issue right now.
Right. Alejandro Velasco, of course, the countries of Latin America have been hit very hard by the pandemic, as have countries throughout the world. But as countries begin this long recovery that we are seeing in some parts of the world right now, do you see a resurgence for Latin American countries, which are largely commodity-driven?
Yeah, that's the big question. I mean, I think what we have tended to see in terms of the impact of COVID across the region is what economists are really calling a retreat of basically 20 years worth of social advances, economic advances in the region that are not actually poised to return in the medium or even perhaps long term unless there are major and massive investments by the state, but also by private sector. And that is really, you talk about sort of what might happen afterwards. We're not even at the what might happen afterwards stage in many parts of Latin America. The COVID infection rates are climbing, they're not lowering. The death rates are climbing, they're not lowering. The vaccination rates are nowhere near par to the state of the pandemic. And so there's this, in the context of that, what you also see are massive amounts of discontent and protests spilling over that also, of course, become, carrier, super spreader events in places like Colombia, in places like Chile, which seem to have had, some success at vaccinating. We see new variants emerging and rates there are going up, right? So I think that the larger problem right now is that the political and economic situation across the region is of such, dire straits that really, I think, completely agree with Gustavo before, that really is preponderant, even beyond the effects of COVID, in terms of laying out a potential turnaround after the COVID crisis abates. That is at the heart of whatever might happen in Latin America in the future.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.